Hello everyone, as you read the title today, we're going to be talking about one of the most infamously mysterious characters in the Five Nights at Freddy's series. Shadow Freddy is an interesting character that has always intrigued me. Back when he was first introduced as a rare Easter egg in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, many people have speculated at the identity of this mysterious dark bear. Well, I think with all the extensive information we have now, we can come to a proper conclusion on what the character of Shadow Freddy actually is. The answer to what type of entity Shadow Freddy is actually lies in the context of one of the voice lines from a character in Ultimate Custom Night, that character being Nightmare. Listen to what he says to William Afton in Ultimate Custom Night.
I am your wickedness, made of flesh.
Nightmare in this voice line mentions that he is William Afton's wickedness made of flesh. I think Nightmare's line here is very literal, and it connects back to Shadow Freddy. For those of you who might not be aware, Shadow Freddy and Nightmare are heavily implied to be connected. In fact, they are heavily implied to be the same entity. In Five Nights at Freddy's 4, the texture file used for the Night 7 title, which is called Nightmare, since this is the night in the game in which the Nightmare character appears, it's actually labeled as Shadow Freddy in the files. And Shadow Freddy and Nightmare being the same entity would just make too much sense if you think about it. Shadow Freddy appears as a dark, shadowy variation of Golden Freddy. In Five Nights at Freddy's 4, Nightmare appears as a dark, shadowy variation of Fredbear, a character who was heavily connected to Golden Freddy. It's an easy connection to make, and for those of you who will argue that Nightmare Fredbear isn't Golden Freddy, first off, he shares behaviors with Golden Freddy. He's a version of Fredbear, which automatically connects him to Golden Freddy, and Nightmare's colors are an inverse of Golden Freddy's colors. Also, Nightmare's line about being Afton's wickedness made of flesh is explained perfectly if he is Shadow Freddy. In the end of night minigames of Five Nights at Freddy's 3, we see the original Freddy's animatronics lured by Shadow Freddy to the safe room. What matters here is what Shadow Freddy is doing in these minigames. He's luring the animatronics away to the safe room, just like how Afton lured the missing children to the safe room, who possessed the animatronics. It's a recreation of the missing children's incident. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 heavily implies that the safe room was where Afton lured his victims to, based on what Ralph says about the safe rooms in the Springlock training tapes.
And under no circumstance should a customer ever be taken into this room and out of the main show area. Management has also been made aware that the Spring Bonnie animatronic has been noticeably moved and would like to remind employees that this costume is not safe to wear under any circumstances.
It's obvious that based on the fact Ralph feels the need to clarify that customers shouldn't be taken into the safe room, and he mentions that someone moved the Spring Bonnie suit immediately afterwards, it's clear he's referencing the missing children's incident. Not to mention the safe room is a room that is soundproof, it's not included in the digital map layout of the building, and it's completely off camera. It's the perfect place for Afton to commit a crime. And not only do we have Shadow Freddy luring the animatronics to the safe room the way William did, but he also says the words "follow me" to the animatronics, something we are shown in Fruity Maze from Pizzeria Simulator that Afton also said to the children when he lured them away. Shadow Freddy is imitating the actions and words of William Afton, which makes sense if he is the embodiment of Afton's wickedness, as Nightmare suggests. Also, notice how Shadow Freddy seems to follow Afton wherever he goes throughout the games. Shadow Freddy appears in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, where Afton is shown in Save Them to be working as a security guard and murdering another group of children. Shadow Freddy is in the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location in Follow Me because William Afton is there. Even in Fazbear's Fright, Shadow Freddy appears as an Easter egg inside of your office. And yes, this is Shadow Freddy. If you increase the lighting and saturation of the picture, you can see these colored purple. And as we know, Fazbear's Fright is where Springtrap is. Another connection between Shadow Freddy and Nightmare that I don't see many people bring up is actually from the Five Nights at Freddy's novels, specifically the Twisted Ones novel. Nightmare is actually a character featured on the front cover of the novel, which seems like an odd choice for Scott Cawthon to make. I mean, why Nightmare? Nightmare doesn't appear in the Twisted Ones story at all. Is he there to draw a connection between the Nightmare animatronics and the Twisted animatronics? I don't think so. The Nightmare animatronics and the Twisted animatronics are very similar, as they're both created by William Afton and use illusionary technology to make them have a more frightening appearance. However, while the Twisted Ones are brought to life by illusion discs in the Twisted Ones novel, The Tales from the Pizzaplex story Didophobia confirms that the nightmares are given their monstrous appearance by hallucinogenic gas rather than illusion discs. Not to mention, Nightmare is not implied to be an illusion like the other Nightmare animatronics. Nightmare never appears in Didophobia once. Only Nightmare Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy do, and he isn't anywhere on the Breaker Room map. Nightmare specifically appears in FNAF 4, and despite the fact that FNAF 4 is definitely connected to the experiment rooms, the security logbook and the distorted phone call from Five Nights at Freddy's 1 confirm that Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is a dream of Michael Afton. So then, how do we justify Nightmare being on the cover of the Twisted Ones? Well, him being on the cover of the book actually makes sense if you notice that Shadow Freddy actually appears in this novel. In a blink and you'll miss it moment, during the Twisted Ones, John, Jessica, and Clay Burke all have a brief encounter with Shadow Freddy. I'll read the passage now. Something rustled in the trees ahead of them. Jessica grabbed John's arm, then released it quickly, looking embarrassed. The sound came again, and John started toward it, raising a hand to signal the others to stay. He made his way cautiously through the trees, glancing back once and noting that Jessica and Clay were close behind, despite his attempt to keep them back. A few feet farther on, the trees broke into an open field. They had reached the far side of the woods. Jessica gasped, and a split second later, John saw it. Halfway across the clearing, a figure stood in darkness. It was almost featureless and flat, scarcely distinct from the shadows. John squinted, trying to get a hold of the image, to assure himself that he was really seeing it. Heavy, black electrical wires stretched above the field like a canopy. But besides the wires, the field was clear. Though it was dark, there was no way for them to sneak closer to the figure without being seen. So John straightened his shoulders and began to walk slowly and openly toward it. The field was untended, and the tall grass brushed against John's knees as he walked. Behind him, Jessica and Clay made rustling sounds with every step. The wind whipped the grass against their legs, blowing more ferociously with each step they took. Almost halfway across the field, John stopped, puzzled. The figure was still there, but it seemed as far away from them as when they'd started. He glanced back at Jessica. "Is it moving?" she whispered. He nodded and started walking again, not taking his eyes away from the shadowy figure. "John, it looks like Freddy." "I don't know what it is," John answered, cautiously, "but I think it wants us to follow." So what does Shadow Freddy want? Why does he do what he does? Why is he following Afton around and seemingly even helping him in some instances? Well, it all comes down to the type of creature Shadow Freddy is. An entity created from dark, negative energy, a manifestation of the pain and suffering Afton caused during his murders. This actually ties back to something we see shadow entities do in the Fazbear Frights. In the scrapped Fazbear Frights story, You're the Band, we follow a mother named Sylvia and her son Timmy. Timmy has an obsession with Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, despite the restaurant being closed for nearly 30 years in the story. She ends up buying Timmy an authentic Freddy Fazbear mask from an online auction. After Timmy wears the mask, he begins to act strange, and his personality changes. At some point in the story, Sylvia comes to Timmy's room at night and finds him talking to a shadowy figure outside of his window. Quote from the book. In his dark room, Timmy sat on the edge of the bed in his pajamas, talking so softly that she couldn't make out individual words. But the thing that really frightened her was what Timmy was talking to. It was a shadow, much larger than any shadow Timmy would cast. It extended from the foot of Timmy's bed all the way up to the wall, its shape vaguely humanoid, in that it seemed to have a head and shoulders. The shadow turned to face her, staring at her with beady white eyes, then slinked up the wall and retreated into the air vent. Later in the story, Sylvia comes into Timmy's room again, but finds him gone, and she looks out the window to see him following a shadowy figure away from the house. But then she saw the open window. It had definitely been shut when she had tucked him in for the night. She ran to the window and looked out for signs of Timmy. Halfway across the length of the backyard, a large, shadowy figure walked, holding a small boy by the hand. "Timmy!" Sylvia screamed. "Timmy!" Her voice was drowned out by the sound of the dogs barking. With the strength and agility that only comes during an emergency, Sylvia climbed out of the window. She hit the ground running, chasing Timmy and the shadowy captor. But even though Sylvia was running, and Timmy and the shadow thing were just walking, she couldn't catch them. They were always just out of reach. Sylvia then meets Mike, a security guard from the old Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. It's revealed by Mike in the story that someone had broken into Freddy's and stolen the mask of the real Freddy Fazbear, the mask that she had bought for Timmy. They find Timmy at Freddy's and manage to save him by placing the mask back on his head and waiting for the eye holes to glow before removing it. The head is then returned to the real Freddy, and they leave. It turns out that after Timmy had put on the Freddy mask, he had become possessed by the spirit of the child who possessed Freddy, and Mike explains what he believed the shadow was. Mike pulled the car out onto the road. All I know is that something was alive in that Freddy Fazbear head, and when Timmy put it on, that living thing went inside him. "That's why I felt weird?" Timmy asked. "Exactly," Mike said. Sylvia shook her head. This was all too strange to take in. But what was the shadow thing? The shadow knew that living thing was inside of Timmy. I think it was trying to get it out. So whatever the shadow creature was in the story, it specifically wanted the soul of Freddy inside of Timmy. Why does this matter? Because in Five Nights at Freddy's World, the line of dialogue given to Shadow Freddy during the loading screens is, "I will eat your soul." Do I think that the shadow in You're the Band is actually Shadow Freddy himself? Not exactly. He's never described as looking like a bear, and although he does lure away Timmy, which is a behavior of Shadow Freddy, the way the shadow slithers into a vent reminds me of Eleanor. I still think this shadow creature is something akin to Shadow Freddy, with it wanting the soul inside of Timmy and leading him to Freddy's. There's definitely some kind of connection there. In fact, this might be why Shadow Freddy helped Afton dismantle the animatronics in Follow Me. He wanted to get to the souls and agony of the animatronics inside. FNAF AR depicts Shadow Bonnie as a being made out of dark, shadowy remnant, and guarding the light remnant in the game. So if Shadow Freddy is a similar character, that might be why he helped Afton dismantle the animatronics. So we have Shadow Freddy's potential motive, his connection to Nightmare, and we know what type of creature he is. But how did he actually come into existence? We know he was created from the wickedness of William Afton, but which deed of Afton caused him to be created? Afton has done a lot of wicked deeds in this series, so he could have gone from any one of those. Some people might say he was created from the missing children incident, which could make sense as he replicates what Afton did during the missing children's incident. And we've seen before that immense agony from that incident has caused other supernatural beings to be created, such as the yellow rabbit from Into the Pit. However, Shadow Freddy's creation might go back even further, to the very first murder William Afton ever committed. I'm specifically talking about Take Cake to the Children, or more accurately, Charlotte Emily's death. I think this could be a potential contender for the birth of Shadow Freddy. But why this is important is actually because of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. In the very few teasers that Scott Cawthon made leading up to the release of Pizzeria Simulator, Cake Bear, the Freddy in the Take Cake minigame, is actually used as the mascot for Pizzeria Simulator, with him slowly morphing into the Pizza Tosser Freddy from the beginning minigame of Pizzeria Simulator, which heavily implies that these two Freddys are the same character. In fact, both Pizza Tosser Freddy and Take Cake Freddy both feed young children dressed in green. Here's why this matters in the context of this video. That being that Shadow Freddy is in the Pizza Tosser minigame. If Pizza Tosser is meant to just be an updated version of Take Cake, then Shadow Freddy here could potentially imply that he was created by the existing agony of Charlotte's death. That might explain why he's specifically a bear character. Charlotte's death had a Freddy character present, which could give a better explanation of Shadow Freddy's appearance. Now here's where many of you, I'm sure, will be quick to point out. Shadow Freddy seems to always be a shadow variant of Fredbear or Golden Freddy. But Cake Bear is regular brown Freddy, right? Well, is he? We know he is Freddy, that's been confirmed. But he might be a little different from the Freddy Fazbear we know. In the Fredbear's Family Diner posters we are given in Security Breach, we actually don't see a yellow Fredbear as the mascot of Fredbear's Family Diner. Instead, we are shown a brown Freddy. And we know this is Freddy specifically because the Fredbear Singing Show ticket calls him Freddy, but also the cutout of Fredbear in Ruin is specifically called 70s Freddy in the files. And because I know there's going to be some people who try to argue that Spring Bonnie and Fredbear are the same color in these posters, first I'd ask you, are you colorblind? And second, I'd show you that we get these posters again in Five Nights at Freddy's Into the Pit, and we're shown that Freddy is clearly brown while Spring Bonnie is yellow. So what does this have to do with Fredbear? Well, considering that all of Fredbear's marketing shows Freddy on the posters, I believe this is meant to show us that at some point, the brown Freddy and Fredbear were indistinct from each other, and only later on did Fredbear become the yellow bear we all know him as. Originally, I think Fredbear was the brown Freddy animatronic. This would explain how Fazbear Entertainment existed before Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, because Freddy Fazbear as a character existed as the mascot of Fredbear's Family Diner, before they became separate characters. So, what if Freddy in Take Cake to the Children and in Pizza Tosser is actually Fredbear using his earliest design? Then Shadow Freddy taking on the appearance of Pizza Tosser Freddy isn't actually that far-fetched of an idea, since Shadow Freddy would still be continuing to imitate whatever the appearance of Fredbear is at that point in time. In this case, Fredbear still being Freddy. Although because Fredbear is yellow by the time of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, that means that Charlotte would have had to have died before the bite of 83, and died at Fredbear's rather than Freddy's. Although the novel trilogy does support this idea. And there is one other thing that could connect Nightmare to Charlotte's death, that being Nightmarion. Despite the fact that FNAF 4's Halloween DLC is not canon, it is interesting that Nightmarion is the character that takes the role of Nightmare, which might suggest that they are connected. To add to this, all the Nightmarion plushies in both Security Breach and Ruin are specifically called Nightmare plushies. And in one of Nightmarion's voice lines in Ultimate Custom Night, it seems to connect him to Charlotte's death and her becoming the puppet.
I am the fearful reflection of what you have created.
Perhaps Nightmare and Nightmarion are connected, and even the same entity, both taking on the different forms of animatronics which were present at Charlotte's death. It's at least something to think about. Regardless, I hope you all enjoyed the video and at least thought my insight was interesting. Thank you for watching.